All right, welcome back to this beginning tutorial, and today we're going to be taking a look at depth of field. Now, as we've already discussed, depth of field can be controlled by the aperture in your camera. However, there's also two completely different other factors that help determine depth of field. Now, the first thing that we need to understand is what in the world is happening and what is the field. So the field is going to be represented by this red line that we see right here. And this is going to be the point on our subjects in which we focus. Now look, when a camera focuses, it's not on one single point, it's on all the points up and down this line. And those will correspond to the sensor, which is in here inside of your camera. We're just looking at one point. We're not going to look at all the points because that would be too complicated. So in this, we have a camera, we have the lens, and in this case, it's showing us the aperture. In this image, there's a large aperture, meaning the iris is wide open, letting in a lot of light. And in this one, it's closed down and it's letting in a little bit of light. So this would be an example of maybe f/22, and this would be an example of maybe f/4. So the way this works is the light is focused on the lens and then focuses back onto the sensor. The depth of field is represented by these dotted lines that we see here. The depth of field is the distance in front of and behind the subject that's in focus. In a shallow depth of field, like this is exempling, we might only have an area from here to here that's in focus. And with a large depth of field, we might have an area from here to here that's in focus. The depth of field is that distance that is in focus. And in this example, you can see as the light rays spread apart faster, you get a shallower depth of field. As the light rays spread apart slower, you get a larger depth of field or a wider depth of field. So more is going to be in focus. So depth of field is really determined on how fast the light rays spread apart. So in this case, because they're spreading apart faster, we have a shallow depth of field. And in this case, we have a large depth of field. So let's take a look at two images that show both a shallow depth of field and a large depth of field. So this is a good example, not the most exciting photograph, but this is a great example of a shallow depth of field. We can see this part of the barbed wire fence is in focus, but literally the little piece behind it is already out of focus, and quickly the whole image falls totally out of focus. This is an example of the light rays spreading apart very quickly, and this is a shallow depth of field. In this image, notice everything is in focus. So from the foreground just about to the background, everything is in focus. So in this image, the light rays are spreading apart really slowly, and we are getting a large depth of field. So if we assume that, let's say we focused on this box right here, everything behind it back to the trees and up here into the foreground is in focus. If this was a shallow depth of field, this area would be out of focus and this area would be out of focus, but only this area would be in focus. So let's go ahead and take a look at the three different factors that make up depth of field in photography. And so the first one we've already learned, that is your aperture on your camera. A small aperture of an example of 2.8 has a shallow depth of field, meaning not a lot is in focus, and a large aperture like f/22 has a wide depth of field, meaning everything would be in focus. The next factor that we have is focal length. Now, focal length is represented as millimeters on the front of your lens. So if you look on the front of your lens and you have a 35 millimeter lens, that's your focal length. That focal length means the distance from the sensor of your camera to your lens. So that distance is focal length. If you have 135 millimeters, that would be a longer focal length. And that would be the distance, once again, from the sensor to your lens. So that's going to be a longer distance via a longer focal length. So in this case, a long focal length, like a telephoto or a big long zoom lens, has a shallow depth of field. So in photography, a lot of times when you're doing portraits, you shoot with a 135 or a 200 or a 300 millimeter lens because you want a shallow depth of field. You want that background to go totally out of focus. And a wide focal length, so a wide angle lens where you would shoot and it would see just about everything. You would use something like this for a landscape image. So a wide focal length has a wide depth of field, meaning everything is going to be in focus. The last one we have is distance to subject. Imagine your subject doesn't move and they're in one spot. If you get closer to your subject, you're going to have a shallow depth of field. So the closer you get to your subject, the shallower depth of field. In macro photography, you get really, really close to your image. And you'll notice a lot of times in macro photography, you have a difficult time getting everything of your subject in. So if you had a little bug, his eyeballs might be in focus, but his wings on his back might be totally out of focus because you are so close, you have a shallow depth of field. And as you move far away from your subject, you have a wide depth of field. If you were taking a picture of a landscape and the mountains were miles away, there's a good chance that even if you had a low aperture, everything is still going to be in focus. Because why? Because you are a long ways away from your subject, and that's going to increase the depth of field. Now, depth of field isn't just this, or this. It's a combination of everything. If you think about this, if you had a wide angle lens and you were a long ways away from your subject, that's two factors that are going to give you a wide depth of field. So if you were shooting a landscape, most of the time you're using a wide lens and you're far away from your subject. So you're already going to have a large depth of field. You can actually shoot at a small aperture in that case and still get a pretty large depth of field because these two factors are going to override a lot of what your aperture is set at because they're already set up for a wide depth of field. And that happens exactly the same with shallow depth of field. So if you had a really long lens and you were close to your subject, you're going to have a shallow depth of field, whether you're at 2.8 or f8, you're just going to have a shallow depth of field. Now you're going to get a shallower depth of field if you shoot at 2.8, and you're going to have a little more in focus if you do f8. Now remember, when you're shooting depth of field, it's always a combination of these three elements that's going to determine whether you have a shallow or a wide depth of field. So let's go ahead and take a look at these individually so we can see what's happening. We'll take a look at aperture first, since this is one we've already covered. In this case, our camera is in the same spot, our subjects are in the same spot, and our lenses are in the same spot. The only thing that we're changing is the opening size of the aperture. So here we have a large aperture or wide open, and here we have a small aperture. Notice as the light rays come in and go back out, they're spreading apart really fast, giving us a shallow depth of field. The light rays are spreading apart really slowly, and this is going to give us a wide depth of field. So let's take a look at the two new options that we have. The first is going to be distance to subject. So in this case, our subject's in the same spot. We're using the exact same lens, but we're moving closer in this image and farther away in this image. And as we move close to our subject, notice that the light rays spread apart really quickly. And we know that when the light rays spread apart quickly, we have a shallow depth of field. And as we move farther away from our image, our light rays are still apart pretty far, but they're not spreading apart as quickly as up here. So in this case, we are going to have a wider depth of field than up here because distance to subject matters. The closer you are, the shallower the depth of field, the farther away, the wider the depth of field. The last one that we have, our cameras are going to be in the same spot. Our subject is going to be in the same spot. But in this case, we're going to change our focal length of our camera. So here we have a long focal length. So the lens is long ways away from the sensor. This is going to be an 85 millimeter lens. And then here we're going to have a 20 millimeter lens. And notice this is really close to the camera. Our apertures are going to be exactly the same. The only difference here is the focal length of the camera. Focal length is measured in millimeters. And if you don't know where this most likely will be found on the very front of your camera lens. In the case of a long focal length, you'll notice that the light rays spread apart really quickly, giving us a shallow depth of field. And a wide angle lens, where the lens is really close to our camera, it makes the light rays spread apart much slower, giving us a wider depth of field. So once again, we have aperture. A small aperture gives us a shallow depth of field. A large aperture gives us a wide depth of field. And focal length, which is read in millimeters on the front of your lens. A long focal length gives us a shallow depth of field, and a wide focal length gives us a wide depth of field. Distance to subject, if you are close to your subject, you have a shallow depth of field. And if you are far from your subject, it gives you a wide depth of field. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of images in depth of field. All right, so we're looking at this very first image. You can see you cannot even see the background. So because this flower is really small, we must be really close to our subject. And because we are so close to our subject, the background is going to be out of focus. We could also have a very large aperture, meaning a small f-stop number, and that is also going to contribute to depth of field. So here's another example of shallow depth of field. Notice that the background is totally out of focus. So in this image, we're using a longer focal length, and when you have a longer focal length, that can give you a shallower depth of field. We could be really close to our subject because it's not very big, so we have to move up close to it to make sure it's in focus. Now, one thing you need to pay attention to when you're using a long lens, or any lens in this case, they all have what we call a minimum focusing distance. Some of those might be 3 inches, sometimes it might be a foot, sometimes it might be 3 feet. So you need to know the minimum focusing distance of your lens. Because even though you have a lens on, if you get too close to it, you'll never be able to get it in focus. And the last factor here is we could be using an aperture of f2.8, which is a wide opening, and that gives us a very shallow depth of field. So here we have some pictures of horses, and notice that the horses are very far away from where we are at the camera. Now, this isn't a super wide angle lens, so that's not going to be really contributing. What most likely is contributing to this being a wider depth of field. And notice it's not perfectly in focus back here, and this is a little bit in focus. So this is almost a great middle of the road option where it's not shallow depth of field, but it's also not a super wide depth of field. It's almost like we're hovering in the middle. In this case, we have sort of a longer lens, not a super long lens. We might have a medium aperture, and we're a pretty good distance, so that's going to help contribute to the wider depth of field. In this portrait of the dog, notice the dog's head, eyes, and nose are pretty much in focus, but as we quickly get back to the ears and the body and the tail, it's really falling out of focus very quickly. So this is a good example of a shallow depth of field. So in this case, we have a long focal length, a small aperture, and we are close to the subject, all contributing to the shallow depth of field in this image. So here we have a wedding photo, and notice that the weeds and grasses in the front are all in focus, and everything is in focus all the way back into the mountains and the clouds. So in this case, we have a wide angle lens. We probably have a small aperture, which is a high f-stop number. And we are a pretty good distance away from our subjects, all contributing to that wide depth of field that we see in this image. And our last image is going to be this portrait of this little girl. And the reason I put this image up, it's obviously a shallow depth of field, but the softness of the out of focus areas really contribute to the mood and the feel of this image. If everything was in focus, it would invoke a totally different meaning, but having that softness of her hair and the flowers and everything going on in this image is really what contributes to the emotion that we feel or see in this image. Well, that's it for this tutorial on depth of field. What I can tell you, the best way to practice and learn depth of field is just to do something simple. Set an object up on a railing and then go ahead and practice. It's going to do two things. It's going to first show you how depth of field is affecting your image. As you start adjusting your aperture and other aspects of your camera, you're going to have to adjust your ISO and your shutter speed to compensate for the differences in exposure as well. So you're going to be learning more than just depth of field. But then go ahead, just take that one subject and take it and shoot it with a small aperture and then a large aperture and then a long focal length and then a wide focal length, and then move close to it and move far away from it. And you're going to see how those different aspects of depth of field change the look and feel of your photographs. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below. And as always, don't forget to subscribe.